Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Donald. I'm a member of the Board of Directors, and I'm going to be here to host Dale Atkinson, who is a familiar face to all of us, who's been doing such great presentations all year for this regulatory hour series. Before we get started, if you didn't hear me yet, we're going to be using polling. So if you can go to slido.com, this is the code, or you can use the QR code there so you can participate in the polling. I know Dale likes to make things interactive. Before I get started, I just wanted to give you an update on the next 3 seminars. Next week on October 28th at 4 o'clock, there's going to be a presentation called Physical Therapy Reaches Across Borders with the PT Compact. So we'll be hearing more from the PT Compact folks. On November 2nd, Reaching Stakeholders Through the Power of Effective Communication, and that's 4 o'clock on November 2nd. And then on November 10th at 4 o'clock, there'll be a presentation webinar, A Collective Approach to Increasing Fairness and Reducing Bias on the NPTE. So I'll re-announce those at the end of this presentation. But with no further ado, I want to introduce Dale Atkinson and his next presentation for our regulatory hour. Dale?
Good afternoon, everybody. I almost started chatting on mute, and some of you might prefer me to be on mute when I do that. So you're allowed to laugh, by the way, and you certainly, as mentioned by Ellen, and by the way, thank you for that introduction, for all of the programs that FSBPT is working on to provide you all with information on an ongoing basis. Hopefully I can contribute to that as well. So welcome and thank you to everyone for being here. I started all my presentations with a big sincere thank you to FSBPT, its board of directors and staff for putting on these regulatory hours, not only that I'm involved with, but all the others that you hear about through your communications with your organization. And this is the one way for you all to keep up to date on some ongoing current issues, as well as continuing dialogue between you as members of your organization. So welcome and thank you. The big thanks goes to everybody on the line today. One, whether you're an administrator, executive director, whether you're a board staff, department staff, inspector, attorney general, representative, or volunteer board member, you all need to be thanked for the important work that you do related to regulation of the profession of physical therapy. And so you're not thanked enough, so I will give you a big thanks at least to get this started. And so I say that with all sincerity. As we move into our 10th month of doing these over the course of the year, I'm assuming, I make some assumptions that we have some regular folks here, so you kind of get the idea of how things work. If you're a first-time attendee, no problem. Feel free to unmute and participate, use the chat box or anything else. If you go to the next slide for me, please. Today, because we are using Slido, I will be prompting Rich, so big thanks to Rich for helping me advance these slides. I can't do that here and work the Slido at the same time. So to get us started, to make sure you guys are awake and listening and understand how to use the chat, if you want to go ahead and chat the designation that best describes you right now, 1 through 9 up there. So we'll see if these chats start coming through. And we'll make sure that we understand that we see a 9 already. We see another 9 already. So let's guess we're going to have a lot of 9s here that sometimes perhaps you feel overwhelmed with your regulatory obligations and others. I will make an assumption too that some of those 9s are probably more on the administrative side than the volunteer board member side, but perhaps I'm wrong on that. So, but thank you for chiming in on that. And we do ask you to chat in and/or use Slido at times. And I will emphasize the fact that if you have something to say, especially if it's a reaction to my remarks, feel free to unmute and speak up, raise your hand, whatever it takes to make sure we get your attention. Ellen, Rich, and Jeff keep an eye on not only the chat, but probably the hand raising as well. So feel free, all 3 of you, to interrupt me if somebody has a burning question or wants to make a comment. I'm very happy to have that happen. So next slide, please. Again, as has been customary, a celebrity lawyer, which is not really me. I have to put that up there, I suppose, as well. But my name is Dale Atkinson. I'm an attorney in private practice outside of Chicago, and I represent a whole bunch of FSBPT-like organizations. So I'm very familiar with and have spent my entire career working with the regulatory side of the professions themselves. And I'm seeing a chat here about speak up, and I don't know if that means I need to project more or not, but Hopefully
I
you
know,
all.
Dale, that was me directing people to make sure they speak up. Not, you're doing great.
Excellent, excellent, no problem. So hopefully all can hear me. So I've spent my 34 years in law practice representing groups like FSBPT. So hopefully my experience over time will help at least guide us through these discussions today and in any future regulatory hours that we continue to have. Most all of my clients develop, administer, score, and maintain a uniform licensure exam program, which is usually their signature program and provides them with the certain sources of revenue to be able to create programs and services that lessen burdens on state government. And that's the definition of charitable, according to the Internal Revenue Service. Therefore, some of your groups, some organizations like yours are deemed to be charitable. But the bottom line is they intend to lessen burdens on state government by providing programs that promote uniformity and facilitate mobility, portability, and others. And whether that is in the mission statement or not, that's where most of the groups are gravitating toward in order to provide these programs and services. And not only do they benefit you as regulators and your boards, they certainly benefit the practitioners to a certain degree themselves, the licensees, the applicants, the renewal process, and everything else. So this is what I do, and hopefully this is helpful related to the remarks today. As far as FSBPT goes now, just to circle back around to that, their ability to provide programs and services, which by the way is yours, these all belong to you as the organization, is an attempt to create situations where you are more efficient as boards in your operations. And so that's really what today's topic is all about. So go ahead to the next slide. And it's kind of a recap where we've been. For those that have not been attending regularly, these are the topics we've covered in red. Today, we'll talk about standard operating procedures, what it means to be efficient. Next month, we'll follow up with communications, and we'll round out in December with 2021 has led to change, some of the things that have gone on. And we'll cover some cases in December as well. So this gives you an idea of how we've meandered down the regulatory avenues here. And there's a method to this madness somewhat, but each of these sessions can stand on their own. So if you're interested, we hope that you're able to attend or can circle back and watch these if they're recorded. So next slide, please. So standard operating procedures is do you as boards, the first question I'll ask you guys is you as boards, you spend time contemplating the processes and procedures that you follow and determine whether or not you can or whether or not you are efficient in this. And I realize I'm going to ask you guys a question in a few slides from now about if you are efficient. And I'm guessing you're all going to say, yes, we are. And that's fine. And I'm sure that you are. But it is very worthwhile for you to step back and say, how is it that we operate? And are we operating as efficiently as possible? And I say this because this is a very important topic. I say this because the scrutiny that's being placed on the regulatory community right now, a lot of it is driven by what is deemed to be inefficiencies. And inefficiencies, and it takes too long to get a license. Inefficiencies in that if I'm licensed in one jurisdiction, can I or why can I not practice in another jurisdiction? And you guys have a compact presentation that was just highlighted that's coming up. But how can we as the regulatory community and FSBPT as your organization best promote these types of efficiencies to try to answer some of the questions that are being asked? Now, I will be the first to say that those asking the questions may not have all the knowledge about how efficient you are as a board or perhaps how inefficient you are as a board. But it is incumbent upon us as the regulatory community, I suggest, is to get that word out and invite people to your meetings and publicize what it is that you do and provide an avenue to ensure that your website is up to date and minutes are in there and that minutes are an accurate reflection of what it is boards do, et cetera. You can think of all the ways to get that word out. But when you get that word out, you want to ensure that you are as efficient as you possibly can. And I know there are some barriers to being efficient depending upon perhaps the governance structure. And barriers is the last word I'll focus on this particular slide, and that is how it's being perceived is that the licensure process may be a barrier, an unfair barrier to entry into a profession or to pursue one's chosen livelihood. And how can we best ensure that we balance the public protection driven aspects of a regulatory process with an efficiency side that ensures that we can answer all these questions being asked by the media, by the policymakers, by the practitioners, by the applicants, by the students, by those in academia and others. So this is a really important topic, but it's very broad, kind of wide open, and you'll kind of figure that out in these next slides as we kind of meander our way around to figure out how is it we're going to make some determinations. So let's go to the next slide. Now, as mentioned, this is going to be interactive. You're going to use the Slido, so you can use that code. I can't remember what it's called now. Use that code up there to make sure that you have access to the polls itself. So if you go to the next slide, this will be our first poll that we're going to ask you, and we're going to identify you as a participant in today's call as whether you are a board member, an administrator / executive director. There may be another term that falls under that. Whether you're on board staff, department staff, perhaps you're a board attorney or otherwise. And it's refreshing to see this types of data so that we can best ensure that our remarks, my remarks in particular, are relevant to the audience themselves. So it looks like a pretty even split among not only board members and administrators. Now I see a lot of others there. So can somebody unmute and just tell me what an other is, just so I know and have a better understanding? Where your designation may not have been in these 4 or 5 we had.
Retired board member.
Oh, okay.
FSBPT staff.
Excellent. Okay. So FSBPT staff, and someone who is no longer on the board, but is still involved perhaps with FSBPT, or you just want to be a regulator for life, whether or not you're on a state board or not. So applause and kudos to each of you. So I'll remember that FSBPT staff as well. So it does appear that the administrators or executive directors probably are going to be the most, and you have, perhaps opportunities to add to these questions and add to the discussions related to the efficiencies we're going to talk about. So next slide, please. So the next Slido is going to be how long you've been in this role. So less than a year, some of you may be new, 1 to 3 years, 4 to 5 years, or more than 5 years. And so we can determine now whether we have veterans, whether we have rookies, and all points in between. I see these jump around depending upon how they answer. I get it now. Okay, sorry. I'm getting used to the Slido myself as well. So we do have mostly veterans. It appears more than 5 years, and those with 1 to 3 years. It's nice for you all to not only for us to see this, but it's nice for you all as participants in this call to see the kind of peers that you're dealing with, and that might help us with some of the questions that might come up, and 2, how we can gather enough data to perhaps continue to provide relevant information. So looks like more than 5 years is dominating, not necessarily surprising based upon the fact that we're dealing perhaps with mostly administrators and executive directors. So next slide, please. So what I'm thinking is a simple question, may not be quite as simple. And does your board have policies, yes or no, or maybe you don't know? And policies, by the way, may come in the form of perhaps considered to be bylaws. There may be another word that identifies that. I will tell you this, that in preparing for today's remarks, and I've done this before for many other groups, and that is when I go to your websites, I have trouble finding your policies. So if anybody wants to unmute and tell me you have policies, but they're not on your website, or anything else, you might want to make a comment as to how one might find your policies. Maybe you consider them to be confidential. So if anybody wants to unmute and answer that question, because we have all yeses and 0 no's and 0 don't know. So everybody on the call today apparently has policies. Anybody want to tell me why they're hard to find? And I don't say that in an adversarial court kind of way.
It appears that Nancy says from New Jersey says that they have trouble finding them themselves.
Okay. It's nice to know it, and I'll continue to just talk a little bit about transparency while someone is going to unmute, I'm hoping, and at least address this question. And that is, government deals in the open, but for exceptions that are addressed within the law itself. So the rule is, this is pretty much across the board, a few exceptions, but the rule is everything you do is public unless there's a reason it shouldn't be public. And that's how most of the statutes are set up. So your policies ought to be proudly displayed and perhaps easily found. Anybody willing to chime in? If not, we are going to move on. We're not going to make anybody talk here. But all right, let's go to the next slide. Get this out of the way. All right. So we really can't talk about efficiencies of boards and standard operating procedures without addressing delegation. So can I get somebody to unmute and tell me what is delegation? You can answer any one of these three. What is it? Why do we have it? And how do you get it? We got a lot of veterans on the line. You guys should be able to rattle off these answers relatively quickly, I hope.
Dale, I think it's Nancy. I think delegation is giving somebody else some responsibility that you think can handle it for a job that is really in your realm.
Very good. Okay, so it's allowing someone else to chime in and do something, perhaps take it to a final decision, perhaps make a recommendation back. There's probably a lot of nuances to that. Somebody else want to unmute and tell me, why do we have a delegation of authority principle or policies, if you will, in place? And policy is probably not the right word. The principle of delegation of authority, why do we have it?
Yeah, I'll try that. It's Ellen. It makes things more efficient. Sometimes someone else can do it faster, better, more timely.
Absolutely.
It's also a great way to, move people along into leadership.
Okay, excellent. And go ahead.
The legal staff of our board will assume responsibility for concerns of legality and not necessarily standards of practice.
Okay. So the role of the lawyer or the legal team helping your board out may be a little bit different, but there may be some delegation driven in lots of different directions. And I would suggest that Ellen, hit the nail on the head, and that is it adds to the efficiencies. The whole reason why a regulatory system is set up and boards are created and authorized to act is to create a system that is efficient and that can handle the intent of the legislation. You can carry out that intent by enforcing, I should say, a licensure system. So you license, you renew, you investigate complaints, and you enforce, you promulgate regulations, and then you do a whole lot of other things that we've talked about over the course of the last 10 months. And so that efficiency issue is extremely important in the all undertaken with following the intent of the legislature. So how is it done? Anybody want to tell me how we effectuate delegation of authority? When I say we, how it is effectuated. I know you guys are out there. There's 35 of you on the line. Let's get somebody to unmute. All right, I will tell you how it's done then. And so eventually you all are going to be hopefully beyond the Slido, and you can unmute and feel free to speak up. And I do say that with all seriousness. We look for candid discussions. There's a few slides that might seem controversial, and I'm hoping we can get some discussions going related to the effectiveness and efficiencies of boards themselves. But delegation of authority is effectuated, if you will, through a couple of ways. One is the legislature enacts a statute that creates the board. It delegates authority to it. It authorizes that board to do something. And in your guys' case, it's to enforce the Practice Act, to carry out the intent of the legislation, which is a licensure system intended to ultimately protect the consumers themselves. So that's a statute. So delegation of authority can be recognized. And you may not even see that phrase within the law anywhere, but it is a system whereby the legislature enacts a law that creates the board. It populates with 7 people. It provides with your board with certain authority to undertake, and your board carries it from there. It can also be effectuated from the board to staff and the staff of the board itself. So in between board meetings, what can the staff do, or perhaps what can the staff not do? And this whole concept of delegation is extremely important to ensure the efficiencies that we look for in a regulatory system itself. And those delegation principles from board to staff are generally going to be had in your policies. Hence why I was looking for your policies, and I found Virginia's. And Virginia's are actually called bylaws. And so their policies actually came up and said duties of the officer, or identifies the officers in duty and the duties of those officers. And they actually have a subsection called delegation. And it authorizes staff to do certain things between board meetings to add to or ensure the efficiencies of the board processes. And these are wise moves for all of you to have so that you can answer the questions by policymakers of, are you efficient? And if so, how? Or what is it that you need to become more efficient? So you see it in statutes, you can see it in policies, you can also see it, this delegation principle, in regulations, where your board may promulgate a rule that says the FSBPT national exam is a great exam, and we will rely upon that as an entry-level competence determiner in our licensure process to therefore make us more efficient, so we don't have to develop and defend our own exam on a state-by-state basis. It also, of course, promotes not only the legal defensibility from a psychometric argument, but it also promotes uniformity from state to state, which then facilitates mobility and portability issues and decision-making that is coming up, and that is on the front burner of all discussions right now when it comes to legislative changes. So that delegation of authority by statute, by rule, by policy, legislator to board, board to staff, or perhaps board to an outside private entity like the FSBPT. So next slide. So somebody want to unmute again? And I'm not having success here on this unmute. And if we were in person, I would walk around and stand in front of a table and hopefully someone would talk. But let's hope, just going to try this one more time. Why are boards populated with licensees? And as the Supreme Court calls licensees now active market participants, why are boards populated with licensees? Anybody?
Hopefully licensees know what is happening in the profession and can give some valuable information.
So they bring up maybe content expertise.
Right.
Okay.
Professional self-regulation.
Say it again.
Professional self-regulation.
Ah, okay. So let's stop quickly on that phrase, self-regulation. Is physical therapy self-regulated? And I asked that just to make you pause and step back, and whoever that speaker was.
Well,
And
we do help write the regs.
okay. And so let's and if you don't mind, I'm going to continue to pick on you. Who are the we?
The PTs on the board.
Okay. Excellent. So it's the physical therapists on the board themselves. There are public members you can see on the right side of the screen as well. And while those physical therapists and public members, by the way, while they're undertaking their responsibilities sitting on a board itself, they are part of government. They are not part of the profession. And I'm only saying this to make the point of, if I'm asked, are professions self-regulated? The answer is no, a definitive no, because self-regulation to me allows government to step aside. If you want to be self-regulated, government should say, or at least should ask this question, do we even need government involved? But you bring up a really good point, and this we have discussed on multiple regulatory hours throughout 2021, and that is this whole issue of why there are licensees on boards themselves, and what is it that is brought to the table, content expertise, efficiencies, and others. But I would suggest that we all step back and re-ask ourselves that question of, is physical therapy self-regulated? And we can all come down with different answers, et cetera, and debate this, but at least from a perception standpoint, we should all think about that question. And it is responsive to that left box. Why are boards populated with licensees? And we could be talking about physical therapy or veterinary medicine or human medicine or anything else. And so we could still ask these same types of questions. And on that right box, boards are populated with public members. Now, the smart aleck answers to both of these, they're populated with licensees and public members, is because the statute says so. So that's kind of the short smart aleck answer. But why does the statute say so? And of course, most boards have at least one, some have multiple public members, some have zero, I believe, but they're populated with public members to provide that consumer perspective that is brought to the table. And hopefully the licensees don't dominate decision-making processes within government, within the agencies or the boards that are statutorily created. So these are important questions from not only a conceptual big picture standpoint, but from an efficiency and effectiveness standpoint. If licensees dominate discussions and make decisions in the interest of the profession and not perhaps thinking of the intent of the legislation and the consumer protection side, that is what leads to legal challenges, which we saw back in 2015 with the North Carolina State Board of Dental Examiners case. And so one is we don't want to fall into that discussion too deeply, the antitrust side of things. And at the same time, we want to ensure that these board members, be they licensees or public members, understand the role they play. They are representing government. So from an efficiency standpoint, if we ensure that that perspective is maintained, I believe that your boards are going to be better off and perhaps avoid some of the legal pitfalls and challenges that might surface, from the standpoint of challenges, legal challenges, litigation. And perhaps we can also prepare ourselves to address the practical questions that come up from policymakers, elected officials, politicians, and what have you. So I think that this is really important. We digest these slides, this delegation of authority, and the roles that are being played. So next slide, please. So next poll question, what describes the regulatory structure in your jurisdiction? And I'm happy to have people unmute when we're done with this and tell me if I've missed anything. Are you a standalone board? Are you a composite board? Are you a departmentalized structure? Is there something other than maybe you don't know, which is fine too? Composite boards, by the way, generally regulate multiple professions under one board itself. So it might be a social work, marriage and family therapists, counselors, addiction therapists, they might be under one mini mental health board, if you will. So we've got mostly standalones. We've got some departmentalized and maybe an other there. Anybody want to unmute from the other category and just describe what I may have missed in my attempt to generalize these categories?
Gail, this is Joanne in Wyoming. Technically, they're a standalone board. They have their own budget. They make their own rules. They don't report to a higher board authority, but they share staff with 20 other boards.
Excellent. Excellent. And so from an administrative standpoint, perhaps the efficiencies are had by sharing staff. So Joanne, do you represent, or do you administer, you're an exec, do you administer multiple boards?
I do, yes.
And how just give us an idea, how many?
I personally do 7. I oversee all 20.
Imagine that. Now, Wyoming may be smaller populace, a little different approach, but everybody on the line, imagine your administrator having 7 boards and the need to have an efficient system set up, both administratively and from the board perspective as well. So thank you for chiming in on that. And that does bring up an interesting question that is relevant to these operating procedures. So Joanne, do you share policies and procedures between those 7 boards? Are they very similar or the same, or are they under one type of policy? Or
no, the policies and the procedures are for professional licensing boards staff, but the boards are all independent, so they all have their own policies, and if that makes sense.
Got it. So you are looking in different directions a lot to try to make sure you're within the policies of each particular board itself. Yes. So that gives us an idea too about how these structures might be looked at. But many of you are identified as standalone boards, meaning as she has mentioned, perhaps create your own budgets, you spend your own money. Your decisions are so-called final. They may be subject to an appeal process, but they're final, as opposed to a departmentalized structure where the decisions from the board may be advisory or recommendations only that go up into the bureaucracy for ultimate affirmation and then, enforcement at some point in time. So there are pros and cons to all these structures. This is not said in any way to try to identify one over the other, but there may be some barriers, if you will, or there may be some obstacles to effectuating change between some of the structures that we have identified up here, which is actually going to be, I think, the slide coming up. So if you want to go to the next slide. So does anybody want to unmute and speak candidly about, does the regulatory structure affect the operational efficiencies of your board? So if changes need to be made. So I'll give you some examples. On the right-hand side there, you can see applications and renewals, investigations, hearings, website modifications, final decisions, anything. Does the structure that you're within, is that either enhanced or inhibited by, let me rephrase that. Are the potential for changes enhanced or inhibited by the structure that you're under? That anybody perhaps wants to unmute and speak to that? There may be some shyness to answer this question. I understand that. So I would ask anybody out there, if I asked you if your final adverse actions are posted on your website, and you might say yes, and then I say, well, how quickly are they posted? Let's say it's finalized in a board order today. When would it be on the website? And if it takes 3 months, how would that be changed, or what could be done to make that happen sooner? And is that something that you make your decision as a board in conjunction with your staff, or is that something that has to be made by someone else in the bureaucracy that may not have all the information that you're subject to? Anybody want to try to address that question, or any type of question related to that? Or let's look at another one. If your applications for licensure need to be changed, does your board have the right to assess the application, seek some legal advice, and if there's changes suggested, just make those changes and effectuate them, within a reasonable period of time? Or does it have to go somewhere else to be approved? Maybe the Attorney General's office, I could understand that. Same thing with renewals.
Yeah, Dale, that's a good one. That for Florida, yeah, there's always, we've done some application changes, and it always needs to definitely bump up to a much higher power. And then something comes back to us with, suggestions or restrictions. And then just general website changes, just informational pieces are very cumbersome to have those things change. I would say when you just want to be able to be outward facing and provide information both to licensees and public, it's sometimes challenging in a large bureaucracy to have that happen.
And as it goes up to the higher power, as you called it, and we're among friends here, so I realize that, and we don't need to repeat this outside of the meeting, but is it a lengthy period of time? I mean, we're talking months?
So Dale, everything goes upstairs.
Okay.
And I've never figured that out because the board office is on the top floor. So just where does it go?
Well, there's a roof, I guess, but
I guess.
But so I asked this, and nobody needs to answer that question. I asked that just to say, that may, well, let me rephrase this. The perceived inefficiencies of your board may not be able to be remedied by those sitting around a table at the board meeting, in conjunction with your staff and perhaps even your legal counsel. And this is what is in part a frustrating process that you may hear from some jurisdictions over others. And how might you then stimulate change that can add to your efficiencies as a board itself? And this is not an easy question, and it's certainly not one we're going to answer just necessarily today in our short discussion. But I believe it is one that I would suggest that you put on your agenda for a board meeting and that it actually, you take the time to discuss that. And the reason that I say that is because one is, can you stimulate change if you need it, by the way? Okay, so let's just make an assumption there's a need to change. And let's say it's the ability to update your website, just to keep a simple example. So you discuss it at an open meeting, it becomes part of the minutes. It shows that you are attempting to become as efficient as possible. And perhaps there are obstacles or there are barriers that need to be overcome in order to effectuate those changes. And so I know I have testified, if you will, or certainly appeared before multiple boards where there might be an issue related to, let's say, one of my clients' exam programs that I can explain to the board itself and answer questions, and the board thinks, okay, great, this is logical, and we need to make a change. And then when it gets pushed to the bureaucracy for that change, that bureaucracy may not have had the benefit of hearing the pros and cons and why this change is being suggested. And so talking to the decision makers sometimes is difficult. And we all have to take that into consideration. And I don't say that as being overly critical of any structures, but I do say that as when you are accused of being inefficient or when the licensure process is taking too long, how do we fix that? And are you in control of the ability to make that? So this is a good question to ask. So I suggested that you put it on a board agenda. I would also suggest that you take the time periodically, say it's every year or every 18 months, that you have a strategic planning session. You actually have a generative discussion with your board. It's an open meeting, it's open to the public, have it like any other meeting, but the only thing on the agenda is some type of strategic planning and generative thinking to allow these types of questions to be addressed and answered. Because the board meetings that I attend and see boards in action, they are addressing these need to make decisions related to applications or renewals or other important issues, CE credits and things like that, as opposed to taking the time to step back and think generatively without the pressures of these day-to-day decision-making or meeting-to-meeting decision-making processes that occur. So these are things to think about, and you all will figure out today's session. We're really trying to stimulate some thoughts and potential ideas that might assist you in effectuating change that adds to the efficiencies, rather than a checklist of things that perhaps you can do, because every jurisdiction is a little bit different. So next slide, please. So anybody want to unmute? Is there a board member on the line that just wants to tell me, how do you describe what is the role of the board member? What do board members do? You show up at meetings, you've got a stack of materials or a box of materials or an electronically issued version of the board booklet itself, and you show up prepared to make those decisions, or you show up prepared to discuss things. How would you describe what it is a board member does? Or on the right-hand side, how do you describe what executive directors, administrators, and staff do? Day-to-day operations. These are the reason I challenge the group here and have you unmute and speak is because you ought to be good at answering these questions. When I say you, whomever the spokesperson is, and that's actually next month's topic is communication protocols, but everybody ought to have some good, short, canned, if you will, elevator speech type of an answer related to what board members do. Well, board members are governor appointed volunteers that bring expertise to the table, as well as the public perspective of regulating a profession. And they do the following. They receive packets, show up to board meetings monthly or however often, and are prepared to discuss important issues and make decisions. Or, however you're going to phrase all of that. Executive directors and staff handle the day-to-day operations of the board itself, realizing that some states are huge populous states and some states are less. And so the staff has maybe a little bit different role, but that staff is delegated with authority to undertake certain decision-making processes related to, and it might be complaints, investigations, it might be applications, it might be renewals, it might be recognition of CE and a renewal process, whatever it is, that you can rattle that off and say, that's all done to ensure that the wheels of regulation, roll smoothly, number one, and number two is ultimately the board is prepared to ratify the decisions made by staff at the next board meeting, as well as give us direction moving forward. And so that type of a discussion is really important, and that type of ability to articulate this is important to ensure that those that hear it understand the effectiveness and efficiencies of the board. So think about this, and I would challenge everyone on the line today is perhaps these are questions you would ask your fellow board members. So let's go to the next slide, please, and take the time to ask those. So how efficient is your board? Super fantastic. We get things done on time. So sloth-like, and perhaps what year is it? As you're answering these questions, I will say this, is that of late, what I have heard with some of the more populous boards, if you will, jurisdictions with a higher population, are that the complaint process and the ultimate adjudications, final adjudications, are taking way too long. So for those of you that are super fantastic, more power to you. I'm assuming that that some of these issues have been addressed and that you do feel extremely efficient in your operations. And we get things done on time is obviously you can see on the top there, the most populated one. So sloth-like, we got a few of those, and what year is it? And so some of you, I think, are understanding then that your efficiencies, if scrutinized, need to be, you need to be able to answer these questions. One is, and perhaps effectuate some changes. So these are, hopefully these questions, these polls give you ideas to perhaps undertake a similar discussion with your boards themselves. So administrators on the line and or presiding officers or chairpersons of boards that are on the line, maybe this can stimulate some of these discussions within your jurisdiction. And you can lean on FSBPT for assistance in ensuring that they provide you with programs that add to these efficiencies. So next slide, please. So relationship between board members, as I'll speed up a little bit as we're running out of time a little bit, and there's a few slides left, but so I'll just chat through these, but somebody unmute or put a chat in if you have something to say. What do board members do before meetings, during meetings, and after meetings? Okay, so before meetings, let's hope that they receive the materials in advance and they read and are prepared to come to the board meeting and meaningfully participate. And we realize that there are some board members that are more prepared than others. We realize some board members who perhaps don't speak much at all, some board members that perhaps speak too much and dominate discussions, and there's all points in between. But it is good to understand what is this relationship between board members. And I would suggest to you, the reason I have this slide up here is to ensure that we understand when board members can talk to each other in between board meetings and when they cannot. And generally the rule would be is they don't talk to each other about board business, that is, because that may violate your open meetings laws and may create situations where you have factions of board members that have discussed something that may vote in blocks or anything else. So the whole idea behind what I said at the very start is government operates in the open. And so your board members have to be careful about what they talk to each other about or when they talk to each other, either before or after meetings. During meetings, let's hope they're prepared, they meaningfully participate, and they're respectful of the decision-making process, whatever the decision turns out to be. So a very important point from the perspective of the laws that may apply to you. So let's go to the next slide. And we would ask the same question about relationship between staff members, including the exec, by the way, between board meetings. So I'm sorry, before board meetings, during board meetings, and after. And so obviously taking care of the day-to-day operations and how that works. And I know some of you may be a staff of one, and some of you may be a staff of multiple folks in managing that whole process. And ask yourselves, how efficient are you, and can there be change effectuated that can add to the efficiency of the board itself, so that when asked or when you need to justify or when you're going through sunset proceedings or anything else, you are very prepared to talk about the efficiencies of the board itself. So let's go to the next slide. So the relationship between board members and staff now, including the executive director, and how that is carried out. So staff on the line, if anybody wants to unmute and tell me, what do you do between board meetings insofar as your communications with the president or the officers of the board or the rest of the board themselves? And how is it that you effectuate the efficiencies of board meetings by getting these board members prepared in advance? Okay, so think about that. And I'm assuming that staff, probably the executive director, administrator, has a fair amount of communication with the president to set the agenda, to ensure notices go out on time, both to the public and the board members themselves, and to ensure that the board booklet goes out in a timely fashion, and that then these board members are encouraged to be prepared. And so this will add, obviously, to the ability of you to have an efficient meeting itself and ensure that you have significant, if you will, or meaningful input from all the board members. And you can take this on, to staff, attorneys, investigators, and others that are involved in the process. So administrators, anybody want to unmute? When do you communicate with board members? And how often? You send them a board booklet. Are there other communications that go out, and when? Or why? And are there limitations, of which the answer, of course, is yes. And so while you're thinking about that, what constitutes a meeting? So we all need to be aware of what constitutes a meeting. And in some jurisdictions, 2 board members constitutes a meeting. And if that's the case, when these 2 board members get together, perhaps if they're talking about board business, which perhaps they shouldn't, but if they are, they may be violating the open meetings laws themselves. So think about this whole slide itself. And I see a comment between meetings as needed, particularly on agenda items. And so likely, I'm guessing that is with your board chair or presiding officer or president that communication goes on. And it has to, in order to create that agenda and ensure that effective and efficient issues. So next slide, please. So one of the ultimate questions asked is, are your board members prepared? And I've already mentioned some probably are, some are over-prepared, some are perhaps under-prepared. We're going to see it all across the board. These are volunteers, governor appointed, and I realize the difficulty in ensuring that volunteers put in the time and effort to ensure that they are good, if you will, board members, and that can be difficult. So I didn't know if there was a story anybody wanted to tell about either prepared or unprepared board members. Now could be the time you could unmute and do that. And again, this is an uncomfortable question, if you will, so I can understand the silence. So,
Yeah, this is Ellen. I think that the biggest concern is when we're obviously dealing with hearings, and you're asking individuals questions and the materials haven't been thoroughly reviewed. It's just not a good situation.
sure.
And sometimes mistakes happen. You misinterpret something, you miss of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of stuff you're looking through. But being able to make sure you're prepared when you're interacting in the hearings, I think, is the biggest thing.
Sure, and that's assuming that board members participate in the hearings. Some do, some don't. Understand that, and you're right. Absolutely, if you're going to participate, you need to be prepared. And don't forget, the interpretation issue and others, that is why you have a hearing. Those are fact-finding events attempting to ensure that everybody can tell their side of what happened and that the right decision can be made. And, I always think that way when it comes to an administrative process, and that is the relaxed rules of evidence and the whole undertaking of an administrative hearing is intended to get to that right answer. You may not always feel that way either in a civil or a criminal proceeding, but in an administrative proceeding you are. And in order to do that, your board members do need to be prepared if they're going to participate in questioning, if you will, or others related to the formal hearing itself. So you can ask yourselves this question, you can ask your board this question, and there are many polls within here that might make up a nice board meeting for you guys to challenge yourselves as a board and as a staff of boards. So let's go to the next slide. So how often does your board meet? Monthly, every 2 months, quarterly, twice yearly, other. You can be thinking now about, is it often enough? Is it too often? I go online and I read board minutes from meetings, and some boards meet for a very short period of time, relatively short period of time. They may meet more often, but it may be a couple hours or less than a couple hours. And if that works, that's fine too. So it looks like quarterly versus monthly, or the quarterly seems to be the predominant frequency that boards meet. And so is it enough? If anybody wants to unmute and at least bring up, we meet too much, we meet enough, we like how it is. Are you getting your work done? And some of these slides, like the next slide's coming up, is what is your work as a board? And how is it that you arrive at these agendas? So let's go to the next slide. So how long is a typical meeting, and what do you cover? Anybody want to unmute and tell me how long is your typical board meeting? Tell us how often it is first, and then we meet whatever monthly for 3 hours. This isn't as controversial, so you all can unmute and say that probably, right?
Hi, this is Sarah from Virginia. We meet on a quarterly basis, and our meetings typically run about 2 hours.
2 hours. Excellent. Is that enough time generally?
Yeah, we're able to get through all of our agenda items usually within that time. I mean, it's give or take, any time depending on the number of items that we have to cover.
Okay. And while I have you and you're willing to speak, and I just lost my train of thought now. I was going to try to put you on the spot, and I was going to try to do it in a really nice way. But by the way, I did read your bylaws, and your bylaws I think are really good, and they do create some nice procedural policy driven issues. And I could find them very easily on your website. So thank you for that.
Great.
So anybody else that might say maybe we're not as efficient as perhaps we could be, that wants to speak up and maybe come up with a suggested solution to that question? So Nancy, 2 to 3 hours monthly, but then you meet 2 to 3 hours shorter when perhaps there's less on the agenda. And
This is Joanne.
go ahead.
I think a lot of it depends on your board members. I used to have a board that once they got their rules rewritten, it was like having a teenager. They just let it go and said, we're good, we're done with our job, we don't have to do anything else. But then I got new board members with fresh blood and fresh ideas, and they've really done a lot of bringing the board together with the strategic plan. So I think sometimes it does matter the type of board members that you have on, and those that stay on as you have a turnover, to continue mentoring the new ones and keeping the flow.
It's a great comment. Joanne, do you have training for your board members when they come on too?
We do, yes.
Okay, excellent. And so maybe that helps. And you heard her mention strategic planning. And so I think that is the way to stimulate this forward thinking process with your boards themselves, so that they don't just deal with the minutia issues. I don't say it in a bad way, but that they think more progressively, more proactively forward as to how you can ensure that you are operating as efficiently as possible within the confines of the intent of the legislation itself. So be thinking about that and what it is that you do cover in these board meetings, and whether they're often enough or too often itself. So next slide, please. And based upon the audience today, ask yourselves, are staff prepared? And the answer to that is of course going to be yes. And I think I see that a lot. Certainly, probably more so than the board members themselves. But I realize that you all are busy, and Joanne's a good example of having multiple boards to ensure that she keeps track of each and every one of those. So ask yourselves that: is are you prepared, and are you efficient? You as an administrator efficient? Florida looks like their staff is fantastic. So terrific on that. So next slide, please. We just have a couple of minutes left. So So I talked about this already just a little bit, but how is the board meeting developed? Do you get input from the board members themselves? How is that done? And is your agenda posted up as part of your notice? And what role does the public play as well? So if you want to unmute and tell us about agenda development, someone can feel free to do that. But you want to ensure that your agenda covers what it needs to cover, number one, so that you do handle the decision-making that should be undertaken. And number two is perhaps you have time then to address public comments, academic comments, FSBPT, which by the way, while I'm on that, FSBPT should be on every board meeting on every agenda. And to me, there ought to be an update on the role of your organization and programs or any other data or input that you can give on every single board meeting. I say this to all of my clients at every profession, so that everybody within the regulatory community and those attending your board meetings start to understand the role that the organization can play and how it is beneficial to each of the member boards themselves. And so, that should be something that should be on every board meeting agenda itself. Next slide, please. I think there was a comment that came up, and I have to open up my comments again. So this is the last slide, really, other than the final question I would ask. So just in our last couple of minutes is board minutes and effective or well-written board minutes. Most of you probably record your meetings in some way, audio or video, or perhaps both. And eventually those actions and the board discussions and others are distilled into some minutes that are approved by the board, hopefully shortly thereafter, or at the next board meeting itself. And these minutes are absolutely crucial to display the effectiveness and efficiencies of boards. They should be well written and tell the appropriate story as to what the board does and did. And I would suggest perhaps if these regulatory hours are going to continue, or if you need a topic for an additional webinar, it would be how to write effective board meeting minutes. And I've said this before, and I'm just going to very quickly say it again. These minutes ought to be populated with data about board operations, phone calls, hits to the website, applications, processed, licenses granted, denied, how long it took on average, renewals, processed, how many were granted, how many denied, how long it took, complaints that received, how many remained pending, how many were resolved, how long it took. That should be in every set of board minutes, so that those reading your board minutes get used to understanding this is what your board does. And it starts to tell their story. And then when it comes sunset time or otherwise, you have a big jump start on the report you will submit to the sunset committee within your jurisdiction. So there's a whole lot to be unwrapped on minutes itself. In the last minute here, next slide, please, is anybody want to unmute and talk about something you have done recently to increase the effectiveness and efficiencies of your board to help everybody on the line today? So we've done the following. We've gone to virtual meetings, and we're going to stick with them because of COVID, but we like them so much we're going to virtual. There's an example. Or we, how you would develop your agendas. Anybody have anything to say that you've done recently that will benefit everybody on the line today?
This is Sarah from Oregon. I can speak. We have recently kind of instituted a consent agenda. And so rather than going through our full ratification report at every public session, we publish that ahead of time and say, this is what the board is going to vote on. And then we do a group of items all at once, rather than going through each thing one by one. And it's cut down, I'd say, on our board meeting time by about 20 to 30 minutes each meeting, which is great because it's always a section that there's never any public comment on. And so it's really helped to kind of streamline those meetings and get into the meat of what we actually need to talk about rather than the routine administrative stuff.
Great suggestion, Sarah. And so that's just done with one motion, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then I'm assuming if somebody wants something pulled off the consent agenda, they can also do that. So it becomes a discussion item somewhere down the road.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. Excellent. So that's a great suggestion there. And since our time is up, anyone who has any other suggestions, perhaps you can either post them in the chat or run them through Rich and Jeff and the staff, and they can put together maybe a small report as part of this meeting and anything else. So if you go to the next slide, I will end my remarks by saying a big thank you again to each and every one of you for what you do and for being on the line today, and for what you do for public protection. The next session for regulatory hour is communication protocols, which is November 17th. But I appreciate everybody's input today and everybody's willingness to be candid in some of your discussions, and look forward to seeing you around the regulatory quad. So Ellen, back to you.
And thank you, Dale. Again, we can never be too efficient, so it's a great conversation. So hopefully we'll get some follow-up webinar on this topic. Just want to remind you that there's a session next week on the 28th at 4 o'clock regarding the PT Compact. And following that, there's a session on November 2nd at 4 o'clock regarding effective communication, which I feel like we can never get enough of that. And then lastly, on November 10th at 4 o'clock, there's a session on increasing fairness and reducing bias on the MPTE. So I want to thank Dale Atkinson again for giving us time and another excellent session. And we look forward to seeing you, many of you, this weekend at our meetings. So bye for now, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for joining us.